Okay, so thank you for coming, everyone. My name is Solis. I'm an MPhil candidate here at Churchill College, reading for International Relations and Politics. And what I'm presenting today began as an undergraduate research project of mine when I was in university at Franklin University, Switzerland. And it's being expanded. I'm working on trying to expand it a little bit more, maybe into a larger research project in the future. But the idea of La Patria Adorada, the adored nation, the beloved country, something like that, in the translation, is this idea that nationalism in the Philippines develops throughout history, and specifically within the late 19th century and the early 20th century, to become something very specific to not only Southeast Asia, but to like formerly colonial areas. And so the development of nationalism within those places is a really interesting topic, I think, to explore the idea of nationalism around. So if you look at here the map of the Philippines, as I wrote in the abstract, that the Philippines is made up of about 7,000 islands, about 2,000 of which are inhabited. There are around 100 million people who live in the Philippines, and they speak about 150 distinct languages and dialects. They're extremely spread out, somewhat isolated depending on the island you're in, and also regionally and sectionally divided based on not only religion, but on cultural practice and sort of like cosmopolitan and rules, a different kind of divide, but there are a lot of kind of sectional divides within the country. And so the real question that I was looking at was, how do you account for this idea of a nation in such a geographically diverse place? A place where people are spread out, primarily a division between the North and the South, and primarily kind of this idea about where they come from in terms of the society and the island. How do these people all kind of get this idea of belonging together as a nation? So the key question then being, how do the people of the Philippines become the nation of Filipinos? Would I guess be a key research question of that. And so in exploring this, I look at a couple of theoretical bases to begin to kind of answer this question. And so the first scholar, one of the primary scholars of nationalism that I turned to is Miroslav Hroch. He's a Czech scholar who wrote a story about nationalism as the national revival of smaller nationalisms within Europe. So basically he took this idea of Czech nationality, of Hungarian, of Slovak, of all these like smaller nationalities in this sort of revival period. And I thought that became an interesting place to start because it actually compares a lot to this idea of anti-colonial or post-colonial nationalism, which has a very specific context because of the way that the nationalism emerges. And Hroch identifies 3 phases of nationalism in his primary thesis. And these are the kind of 3 phases of nationalism that I used to denote how the Philippine nationalist movement develops. So first you have the period of scholarly interest, where it is primarily an intelligentsia-driven movement. The period of patriotic agitation is the period in which this becomes more of a mass movement and the general population is aware of a sort of nationalist feeling. And then finally, in the rise of a mass national movement, it's where the idea of a national identity becomes completely salient within the society, where it is the basis for then figuring out how people around you are connected without, the basic idea of a nation being that you're somehow connected to these people who you've never met, who may be complete strangers to you personally, but you somehow have a connection to them. And in combination with this, I also looked at Emma Hutchinson's recent work on effective communities in world politics, where she actually takes this idea of a shared collective trauma that a society experiences. That the society can experience this trauma together and have this kind of cultural memory of the trauma, and that can be a uniting factor for the political community. So Hutchinson really writes about natural disaster, actually. She focuses a lot on the 2004 tsunami, or the tsunamis, in Sri Lanka and Indonesia and all these areas, and how these kinds of disasters can act as this cultural trauma. So what I did in my research is I actually took her basic ideas about memory and cultural trauma and sort of applied those to kind of the history of colonial domination in the Philippines. So if you look at the timeline of Philippine national development, the first Spanish explorers arrived in the 16th century in the Philippines. And there is a huge gap here in the timeline, basically because the Philippines exists as a Spanish colony for a very long time. And during a lot of this, the timeline really begins in the 16th century because as you look historiographically back through the sources, there is evidence of pre-colonial culture in the Philippines, definitely, probably originating from the Malay area, but there are no documentable sources. There is no concrete written language. We know they had a language, or several languages more likely, but there's no concrete evidence of this in a certain way. So a lot of histories of the Philippines will start in this period where the Spanish arrive, acknowledging that there was a culture there before, but we just don't have any physical evidence of what the culture was like. Probably by design in a certain way, but that's just speculation. So there are several things that happen then in the late 19th century where you can really see the three stages begin to develop around this area. That there's some kind of intelligentsia movement that begins in the late 19th century that begins to transition to a more kind of revolutionary sense, especially as the Spanish-American War begins in the 1890s. And this is the real catalyst for a lot of the revolution that happens in the Philippines. There are three major powers of colonial domination in the Philippines over this time period. The Spanish primarily, the Americans who rule for a while afterwards, and then the Japanese also who invade during the Second World War. So to begin with Spanish colonialism, it was a system that was replicated a lot around the world, specifically in the New World in Central and South America with the encomienda system, which is basically a system of how goods and resources are captured by the state and then redistributed back to the metropole, but how the system was organized from there. But what's very specific about Spanish colonialism in the Philippines is the influence of the ecclesiastical orders. So these sort of mendicant and clerical orders like the Dominicans, the Augustinians, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits, who were the four major religious orders that were actually given a lot of political power over the administration of the Philippines. The Spanish realized in around the 18th century that encomienda wasn't working the same way in the Philippines. So they eventually begin to cede more and more political power to the church officials. And they begin to rule in such a way that that basically gives no voice to the local population. Even priests who are then ordained from the local population, they're known as secular priests, not secularism, but they're known as secular because they don't belong to one of these religious orders. The colonial hierarchy of encomienda exists though, and so this goes a lot into kind of Spanish colonial history, but you basically have this same basic system replicated in major Spanish colonies all over the world. So the peninsulares come from the Iberian Peninsula and normally hold the top positions like the governor general, the captaincy. All of these positions are normally held by peninsulares. And then you have a population of criollos, or creoles, is where that comes from. They are Spanish by blood entirely, but they are born in the colonies, having never lived in Spain, say at that point. So they still hold a lot of the major administrative functions, but aren't necessarily, in the Philippines, they wouldn't necessarily have Filipino blood. A growing population over the span of colonialism in the Philippines becomes mestizo, to the point that by the time that the nationalist period really begins, there are very few of the last group of the Indios, the indigenous people left who are like 100% native, basically. The largest part of the population, even today in the Philippines, is mestizo. It's a mixed race between Spanish and native, Chinese natives. There's a lot of different kind of mixtures that go into this idea of mestizo. And this is really actually where a lot of the people who come behind this revolutionary movement come from, this group here. So there are diverging questions as this nationalist period begins in the late 19th century about what kind of movement are they really sparking. Are they asking for integration within the Spanish Empire? Are they asking for citizenship, rights, that kind of thing? Or are they asking for their independence as an individual, a nation state in its own? This idea of nation state is really becoming salient in the late 19th century, particularly after the revolutions in the mid 19th century in Europe. But you have this idea here of subalternality, which is a huge term in post-colonial literature and post-colonial thought. But this idea that the political voice of mostly native populations is restricted, or of certain populations is restricted. And how do you give people that voice? And actually by tracing this kind of phases of nationalism in the Philippines, we kind of see how things develop to start to move away from subalternality towards a more post-colonial view of nationalism. So one of the primary figures of Philippine nationalism is Jose Rizal. He is the national hero of the Philippines, so to say. He's regarded sort of one of the comparisons I made to people who studied American history is he is the Benjamin Franklin figure. If you want to compare it to American history, he's an intelligent person. He's a polyglot. He spoke at least 11 languages. He was the son of a wealthy landowner, so he was sort of in this kind of upper middle class region of the population. He was Spanish Filipino Creole or mestizo from that area, and he left in the 1880s to go and study in Europe. So he went to Madrid, to Paris, to Berlin was where he spent a lot of his time, to Brussels, and really formed a lot of relationships with other expatriates in this part of Europe, and this is where he got involved with a lot of his idea behind what is the nation. And so he is basically what you call the leader of this Ilustrado movement. The Ilustrado is enlightened, basically. And so it's kind of in this classical sense of, well, we are, the people of the Philippines constitute something very particular and very specific to this area. And why should they not be able to band together and make decisions for themselves? However, he was not necessarily an advocate for independence. He very much, at least in the beginning, while he was in Europe, really advocated for gaining citizenship within the Spanish Empire, gaining recognition and status. And over time, his message evolves, and then his message is then carried on by some people who have, let's say, more radical views later on. But he has a few pieces of literature that he promotes primarily that really exemplify what he's talking about. The most famous one being Noli Me Tangere, which is a Latin title. Touch me not is the literal translation, but it's a quote. It's sort of a play on a biblical quote that Jesus had in there. But the actual idea it's a novel that follows sort of like it's almost it's not exactly autobiographical, but it follows the story of this enlightened Ilustrado who comes back to the Philippines and sees the abuses and documents the abuses in front of him of the colonial system, and begins to kind of think about what does it actually mean to be part of this place that he describes very vividly in terms of like the descriptive what it looks like in the Philippines, what the people are like, how it works. It's a very like imagery-filled book, and I have a quote from there that I put as one of the epigraphs of this chapter there. And in one part of it, the main character says, "The people do not complain because they have no voice. They do not move because they are lethargic. And you say that they do not suffer because you do not see their hearts bleed." So it's a very kind of like poetic description of really what is the emotional factor of colonialism. And it's written in such a way that you would think would it reflect a more emotive feeling among Filipinos of like, yeah, this is not a great thing that's going on to us, and we all have this experience together. An interesting part of this, though, is that it was written in Spanish, which at the time, less than 3% of the Mestizo and Indio population of the Philippines spoke Spanish. So it wasn't necessarily accessible. And this novel actually plays a factor later on in the 20th century as education develops as public education develops in the Philippines. But for now, it sort of like exists as this more historical document of like, what is this idealized sense of the nation, of the Patria, which loosely translates to homeland, but it's a bit of a controversial word. Jose Rizal is executed in 1896, just as the conflict that is the Spanish-American War goes into full force. He's executed by the Spanish authorities there, but there's an interesting story that goes on with one of the last publications that I read about that I used as a source for his story. It's called Mi Ultimo Adios, My Last Goodbye, My Final Farewell. And it's a poem that he wrote, but there's an interesting story that goes along with it too. So that apparently he is aware that the Spanish authorities are coming to execute him, writes this poem by hand in the middle of the night as he's going, and crumples it up and throws it in his fireplace. Doesn't turn the fireplace on though. He just hides it in the back of the fireplace. The next morning, the Spanish authorities come, and Jose Rizal tells his sister, who's in the house also, tells her in English to look in the fireplace. Obviously this is one of those stories that source material, but it makes a great story, at least in terms of the historical development of this. So basically, Jose Rizal is executed, he's shot. This is actually a photo, not a photo. It's not a photo. It's a picture that actually hangs in the National Gallery in the Philippines. It's called The Martyrdom of Rizal. It's very heroic there. But after his execution, his sister goes into the fireplace, finds the poem, and basically is has the poem. It's written in Spanish, but then publishes it in the Imprenta Nacional, which is the revolutionary newspaper of the time. And this poem goes viral in that sense, that people begin to see this idea. It's a really idealized poetry. The language is quite heavy. But one portion that I translated here was, how beautiful to fall to give you flight, how to die to give you life, to die under your sky, and in your enchanted land to sleep for eternity. So there's a side interesting story to this poem as well. It's definitely dedicated to, in the beginning it says, it's dedicated to my beloved country, you know, mi Patria, Adorada. But there's supposedly a double meaning behind the poem as well, because in the previous couple years of this, Rizal was, he was exiled to the north of the Philippines, where he apparently met a woman named Josephine Bracken, who was an Irish-Chinese mestiza from Hong Kong, and apparently had an affair with her as well. And so historians have there's no real concrete evidence for this, it's like another one of those stories, but it's this idea that the poem is this kind of ode to the country, but it's also a sort of last love letter to his lover, which could be an interesting story to follow along with. But anyways, Jose Rizal really captures this first period of nationalism, the period of scholarly interest, the phase of scholarly interest, where kind of it's more an intelligentsia-driven movement. And it moves then after his execution to this man, Emilio Aguinaldo, who is the leader of the Katipunan, which is the primary kind of revolutionary force. Katipunan translates roughly to organization, union, kind of thing, like, you know, a group. But yeah, so Emilio Aguinaldo is leading this revolutionary force, and it definitely comes down in terms of the nationalist question of we deserve our independence because we are a nation of Filipinos. And what he does is he begins to unite leaders from, he says unite leaders from all over the Philippines in his treatise, but he really unites leaders from the north of the Philippines, which I'll talk about later. There's an interesting side thing that's going on with that. But he begins this idea of that independence needs to come through revolution. And it's really this force of we can band together as Filipinos, as a nation, and assert ourselves nationally. So what he really does in order to do this, while the Spanish-American War is going on, he makes contact with Admiral George Dewey, who's the US Navy commander of the Pacific Fleet at the time. And this is while he's in exile during this. But he makes a deal with Dewey basically for Dewey to supply his Katipuneros, the revolutionary group, with weapons, bring them back to the Philippines, and take hold of Manila, basically. Not completely him, but like they take control of the Intramuros, like the old city, basically. And so with the US's help, Aguinaldo is able to reestablish, kind of come in there, establish a provisional government, and declare that this is now going to be a nation of Filipinos. So the war with Spain, the Spanish-American War ends in 1898. Just a bit after Aguinaldo is brought back to the Philippines and establishes this kind of base in Manila. In the treaty that ends the Spanish-American War, I think it's one of the Paris treaties, that ends the Spanish-American War in 1898, Spain cedes the Philippines to the United States. And so the United States claims that they own the land then at that point, or that it's a protectorate of the United States at that point. So this actually inspires the Philippine-American War, which begins the following year. And so Aguinaldo, who works with Dewey, has this treatise. He calls it the true version of the Philippine Revolution. It's a very sort of revolutionary title. But he basically has this treatise that details exactly his conversations with Dewey, or what he purports to be his conversations with Dewey. Going through saying how he agreed that independence was the way forward, this is what we need to explore, but then how he details basically what he calls Dewey's duplicity, how he kind of double-crossed him and goes back to this idea of the United States is trying to go out for land grab. The Philippine-American War ends when Aguinaldo is captured in 1901, and the United States establishes their direct military rule on the Philippines at this point. But Aguinaldo is really important because of his national concept based on Filipinos going out and doing independence, if that makes sense. Like an action-based idea of becoming it's participatory, it's involved, and this is like how we assert ourselves as a nation. This leads us to the American Imperial period. Direct American rule happens in 1907, and after that there's sort of a US-backed legislature mostly built of the landowners in the area. The Philippines becomes a US Commonwealth at this point, and it was run by this man, William Howard Taft. He was the president later. This is him crushing a water buffalo under all 300 pounds of him. And so basically what the American period shows is this kind of, it's not necessarily directly correlated with this last period, this rise of a mass national movement, but what it is the beginnings of the population becomes more literate because of education that's instituted in both Spanish and English primarily. But national languages are also sort of distributed among wherever in the major groups, major language groupings of the area. Pro-independence parties are outlawed, and though the US does are outlawed in this kind of legislature, but as the time goes on, the US administration basically figures out that there's not a whole lot of popular support domestically in the United States for having a colony so far away that it's quite expensive to administer. So they begin to kind of, after the first decade or so, there are more compacts basically between this Commonwealth government in the Philippines that becomes run by Filipinos eventually, and the United States sort of have more of an autonomous status. The entrenchment of these political institutions over time, these Filipinos who become really invested in the land, saying that, well, we're going to work with the Americans to sort of get, the support that we need to kind of build these institutions that really are the basis of what becomes a nation state in the 20th century. The Second World War comes, the Japanese invade and occupy for a while, and then when the Americans come back, it's not just for a while, that sounded glib, but it was actually really, really bad. It was one of the worst times in Philippine history, like overall. But when the Americans come back in at the end of 1945, they retake the Philippines, and there's a discussion about what is actually to be done at this point. And the general that led most of this, General MacArthur, who in American history, basically decides, you know what, this is no longer a tenable position to have. The government in exile that's in Washington, D.C. comes back and forms the Philippine Republic in 1946 at this point. So this is the end of the imperial period over the Philippines being this sort of independent nation that has gone through all this experience of colonialism, is then purported to be united in some sense. However, this is the conclusion basically of the presentation. Is this actually a salient idea? Is this one national group of Filipinos that rule this purported nation state of Filipinos? Definitely this shared cultural trauma of colonialism, of these centuries of colonialism, sort of create a cultural memory among the people in the Philippines of, these are the experiences that we know have been, had for centuries in this land where our people are from, and it's common among almost all parts of the Philippines. And so this is really the basis of what is being Filipino a nation of. There is sort of a controversy of, does this memory persist over time, particularly as the world globalizes? People, expatriation is a huge thing in the Philippines right now. A lot of people leave to go find work and other things like that. And is this experience different among the different groups in other parts of the Philippines? So as I was talking before, most of the areas of the Philippines experienced this sort of Spanish colonialism and then American administration afterwards to kind of inspire this area, except for one of the areas that has been in the news recently in Mindanao in the south. The Spanish never conquered Mindanao, basically. And when the Americans were able to actually eventually go into the region, they didn't have the same kind of power-sharing agreement that they had with the rest of the Philippines. And so it's this question of, does this constitute a different national memory in this area, who haven't experienced the same sort of administration over the same successive period of centuries that were able to be established? And this is actually causing a lot of problems in the Philippines, or has caused a lot of problems in the Philippines since basically independence, and will probably continue to do so. But we can say that, and this is actually an area that I'm planning on expanding this research into, about how does this narrative of this very separate group fit into this whole idea of what is, in the historiography of the Philippines at least, is put out as this kind of succinct national movement, sort of reminiscent of this idea of classical nationalisms that emerged in the 19th century in Europe. So that's basically where I'm at right now. It's a work in progress, but I think this idea of having a cultural memory, a shared trauma, is sort of this idea that hasn't really been explored in nationalism. It's been called other things. It's about kind of this, it's an experience through war, it's a revolution together, but actually labeling it as trauma as part of a cultural memory that people hold within the nation, I think is a pretty interesting concept that it would do us well to explore further. So, yeah, thank you.